Hi everyone, and welcome to my show. I'm glad that you could be with me. The thousands of people that I have that connect with me on this particular YouTube channel. I just want to make a comment about a post I did last week saying that that was critical of the protesters, and that I received heaps and heaps of comments, and stacks of people came up to have a chat about that. And I just want to say that most of those people that did come on and did speak to me, I think you're just as big a morons as those people that were in the rally. It's that simple, really, because you behaved badly and indicated really about the type of people that want to get engaged in this conversation. There were very few, if any, comments about the importance of being able to be reasonable and rational in relation to the issue concerning COVID in this country, and the fact that I certainly agree that people have the right to be able to protest, but certainly not at these times when there are particular rules in place that prohibit such activity. And I was going to talk today about a number of issues that have come up in the press today to offer some comments, to let you know what is happening here in Australia in relation to some primary issues. And I guess one of the things that I'm going to talk about, which I didn't put in the description, was really the number of suicides that happened in the Australian Defence Force. And I am particularly interested in this topic because I worked for many years as a therapeutic counsellor with the Department of Veteran Affairs through the Vietnam Counselling Service, as it was back then. And during that time, I was very much aware of the depression, the sadness, the regret, the way Vietnam veterans were particularly treated as a result of their fighting in Vietnam. And I was particularly I became aware that the degree to which they were vilified as a result of returning from Vietnam was unconscionable, and it was wrong, because many of the young people, many of the older people as they were then by the time I met them, but many of them when they served were young people who were conscripted. Many of them came from the country. Most of them had a romanticised view as to what it was like to fight in a war. None of them knew what actually was going to happen to them. And it became evident over time that many of those people that were, many of the men in particular, obviously, who were fighting had no concept of what war actually looked like, what death looked like, and what it meant to kill somebody or to have someone wanting to kill you. And there was one particular episode I can remember. There's many stories that I heard while working with the Vietnam's counselling service. And I guess one of the most resounding ones was where a young soldier came across someone that he had killed. He reached inside this guy's pocket and he pulled out a picture of this person's wife and their daughter. And in that moment, he realised that they were no different from him. And that moment created a memory which he could not get rid of. That they were killing what they then saw, or what he saw, as innocent people very similar to himself. And were probably conscripted, as he was, to go off and fight this war. They weren't fighting probably for any great ideological reasons, as was the case with our particular troops. And then and how that impacted him. And there were like I heard over the years that I worked there, hundreds and hundreds of stories that related to that. And one of the key issues, I think, was the notion around suicidal ideation, and how their sense of hopelessness and helplessness, the fact that they went off and sacrificed, many of them, 500 in effect, they sacrificed their lives for a fight which they couldn't understand why they were fighting in the first place, and secondly, it was a war they lost. So when I reflect now on what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the world where we've been involved in conflicts, I realised that the same thing has happened, that there are many men out there who have the same feelings and same emotions that many of these Vietnam veterans had when they returned. And that it was interesting to note that many of these men did not understand the impact that this experience had on them until many, many years later. And one of the reasons for that is that there's very little work done by the services, the armed services, to deprogram, if you like, to provide some form of rehabilitation for all of these men. The whole purpose of the military is to be able to dehumanize your opposition. So to be able to make sure that when you're shooting them, it is no different from target practice or whatever. And of course, it isn't until these men actually come in contact with these people and they notice that their heads are blown off, they're missing arms and they're missing legs, that they come to realise how gruesome and how horrific and what a nightmare it is to have that experience. And as a result of that, their mental well-being suffers. And they come back. I remember some people telling us that they were just thrown onto a Hercules aeroplane. They were then shifted back home. They landed in Australia, and they were just left to go and do their thing, to go back to whatever their previous lives were. And many of them didn't have previous existences. They were 18, 19, whatever, 20, I think was. They were young men, and they hadn't established any careers or anything like that for themselves at that particular point. And they came back with nothing. And they certainly came back without any support. And that was particularly devastating to many of them because they also didn't have families. They had families later. And they found it very difficult to relate to people that were around them and people that particularly loved them because they had all this mess stored up inside their head that they weren't able to make sense of. As a result of that, many of them suicided. And it is distressing to note that today, that sense of stress and anguish is still present because the young men we're sending to fight today are no different from those that we sent 50, 60 years ago. And they are coming back with mental well-being issues. And unfortunately, many of those men are suiciding. Now, I personally hold the services responsible for that because even today, through whatever we've supposedly learned about post-traumatic stress disorder and the type of therapies that are available, that we're amiss because so many people are dying as a result of what they experienced while they were away. So there's something terribly wrong with the services. And generally, there is something wrong with the services. So what I want to talk about is, well, firstly, I just need to say, if you're on YouTube, as you probably are watching this, then please subscribe and ring the bell. And if you like what we have to say and you want to hear more about any of my comments later on. So I'm just going to go to this article, which is from the ABC actually. And in this article, they talk about the number of people that have passed away over the last 10 years as a result of suicide. And the figures are staggering. And that there should be something that we all should be concerned about because we're not talking about men now in their 60s and 70s as we were in the past. We're now talking about men who are much younger. And to think that the services cannot provide the adequate services that they need for these people. I know that there are services available now. So there's I forget the name of the service here in Australia, but we did have the Vietnam Vets Counselling Service, which came much later after people had been suiciding and engaging in violent activities and so forth. But in this particular article, it says here that more than 1,200 Australian Defence Force veterans. I don't know if you can read that. More than 1,200 Australian Defence Force veterans and serving personnel have died by suicide in the past 2 decades, almost 3 times higher than the number previously reported. The latest data gives to 1,200 1,200 people. So when we look at the numbers of people that died while serving in Afghanistan and Iraq, the numbers are quite minuscule compared to the number of people that are actually dying once they get home as a result of suicide. The latest data gives a clearer picture of the scale of the crisis in Australia 5 months after the Prime Minister's announcement of a wide-ranging Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicides. Now, they could have done that a long time ago. Why they're doing it now is because the pressure's on them, I guess. But the same problems have been there for decades, and we've still failed to deal with it. So they're looking at the human cost of defence service. The latest figures from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare reveal 1,062 ex-servicemen and women and a further 211 serving personnel took their own lives between 2001 and 2019. It is a dramatic increase on last year's report, which recorded 267 veteran suicides and 198 suicides by serving ADF personnel since 2001. But the discrepancy is due to wider data set now being examined. This year, so often, obviously, when people suicide, sometimes people do it, men do it primarily by running a car into a tree, and it sometimes isn't classed as suicide because a note hasn't been left behind and it's just deemed as an accident. So there are many ways by which men have suicided which can't be classified because people aren't certain, and I guess they're looking at some of those instances now, which is increasing the figure. And this year, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare considered an additional 149 veterans in the survey who had served at least 2 days at least 1 day in the military from 1985 to 2000, more than doubling the sample size of the previous report, which only examined ADF members who came after. So they're looking further back, I guess, at some of those people who would now be obviously in their 50s. Navy veterans are most at risk from suicide. This is an interesting point, with 33% of 100,000 taking their own lives compared to 31 per 100,000 for Army veterans and 21.7 per 100,000 for those who have served. Now, there's not all that much discrepancy between those three figures, but nevertheless, it is within the Navy. So I guess what you would be wondering about is what is there about the Navy indoctrination that would make you think that perhaps there's something happening in terms of their conditioning that would cause them to suicide. And often, a lot of those instances also are not necessarily all about service. They're about being bullied while in service, denigrated as human beings within that organisation, and how that impacts their sense of well-being and how that transposes itself into how they have relationships later on. And sometimes people suicide because they feel hopeless and helpless about the types of intimate relationships that they want. They can't have them, or they break up, or they're violent within those relationships. They don't understand the reason why, and therefore they might choose to end their own lives because of all of that. This increased number emphasises the urgency of the need to continue to work to improve our service and support and to reach out and lean into our veterans. Now, that's been an issue. You know, I was working with them maybe 20 years ago. So to see this now develop as something that is should be addressed is bizarre, given that we've always known it to be there, and to think that now we have to go and address it is crazy. Because we're trying to address it all those 2 decades ago, and we failed. As Morgan said, serving military personnel were about half as likely to die by suicide as everyday Australians due to protective factors associated with ongoing ADF membership. So that's serving military, so it happens after one has served. The risk in particular are for our female veterans, and with respect to our male veterans, if they are young, under 30 years old, have less than 5 years or less of service, and are discharged on medical grounds. So there's a whole host of reasons. But I can tell you now that some of those reasons are that they should not have been serving in the first place, because they should not have been serving in the first place because we shouldn't have gone to war in the first place. It's really quite that simple. So I just wanted to bring that up because that was an issue which particularly is of concern to myself. Now, I wanted to have a look at also So this article is this is about COVID-19 in New South Wales, and it's really about a small number of fully vaccinated people with COVID-19 in New South Wales have died, and there's an explanation offered to this. I just want to say that I think it's really important to have a look at all news articles across the spectrum, because we get inundated with a whole host of stuff from we get bombarded, I should say, with a whole host of stuff that comes from a range of media sources, particularly social media. And we need to particularly be aware as the impact that stuff has on us, and particularly its accuracy. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a moment that the ABC, from who I've got this gear, is necessarily the be-all and end-all around any of this either. But what I am going to suggest is that it's probably a little bit more balanced than the Murdoch press and other major media outlets. And it's certainly far more balanced than what you're going to get off Sky News, which is an embarrassment in itself. So I thought I'd just have a look at this particular article, where 35 fully vaccinated people have now died in New South Wales Delta outbreak, with 3 fully vaccinated patients among the 7 deaths recorded yesterday. Now, the point that this article is making is that you can be fully vaccinated, and if you have underlying health conditions, the possibility is that you may suffer severe illness, or you might die. Never has anybody ever said that this is 100% foolproof. We know that the vaccinations are not, but what we do know is that it's a good chance of saving you from something worse than death, I guess. While that's about 11% of the total 216 deaths since this outbreak began, experts say other risk factors are also at play. So this is about trying to help us to understand what other factors impact those people that have got COVID and those people that are vaccinated. So the director of the Centre for Viral Research at the Westmead Institute for Medical Research said the numbers did not tell the full story. In the trials, of course, we know these vaccines are around about 97% effective against deaths. So that's a statement which we can all accept, and we all need to understand. This is, in essence, that very small percentage of people who are not protected by the vaccine. He goes on to say that the vaccinated patients most at risk die where immunocompromised or in the oldest age group. So clearly, if you're my age, you're likely to suffer from this if you get COVID, even if you've been vaccinated. But then, it's about keeping all of us safe, hopefully. And they say here that New South Wales do not publish the details of whether someone who dies with COVID-19 had underlying health conditions. I have noticed most recently, though, that in some of the news conferences, they're highlighting that more and more. To my knowledge is they are now saying, these people were vaccinated, these people were unvaccinated, and these were the people that were vaccinated but had underlying health conditions. And 20 of the people that they're highlighting here were aged 70 or more. Around 12% of deaths have been in fully vaccinated people. And they have some statistics here which bring up those percentages. So the fully vaccinated, 11%, partially vaccinated, 19.4. These are the deaths. And 63.9 were not vaccinated at all. And it's obvious, I guess it's obvious for those. Now, you can argue, I guess, that the statistics are not true, and that you could also argue that they're trying, that these statistics are provided by the government lie and all that sort of crap. We know that that's not true either. They might distort, they might change a little bit, but the statistics are basically what is actually happening in real time. And they go on to say deaths in fully vaccinated people in the recent. So that's an interesting stat. So it talks about the age groups, and it's quite clear that if you're below 60, there's a lesser chance of dying if you're fully vaccinated. But if you're over that, then there's probably a greater chance of you passing away if you have underlying conditions. And you've got to face the fact that people of my age, I don't have any great underlying health conditions, but that as people get older, they do. Parts of their body start to give away, And as a result of that, if you're even vaccinated, you're still at a high risk of severe illness or death. And so my message to anybody who is unvaccinated and in my age group, get vaccinated. But make sure that you're also keeping yourself safe. And that means that, I think we've heard this 1,000 times before, but all those people that are around you, it's really important to understand that they need to be vaccinated as well in order to keep you safe if you're an older citizen. And then I've got another article here which is also about vaccination. Seems to be a bit of a theme of mine at the moment. Okay. And this is talking about an unvaccinated truck driver in Queensland. So we have these instances where truck drivers or individuals are travelling through states legitimately, I guess, to some extent, even though I've heard this truck driver perhaps wasn't legitimate in terms of the documentation that he had, and will probably be charged for that. And then they drive through, and of course they have stops along the way, and when they stop, they may leave some of that virus behind them, and other people may become infected. And this particular truck driver spent a number of nights along the way, and therefore it becomes a problem for the authorities. But one of the interesting facets of that is that in a place like Queensland, where there are very few outbreaks these days, that tracking that down, so for contact tracing is a much easier proposition when you've only got one or two, obviously, as opposed to hundreds, which they have now in New South Wales and Victoria. So being able to track those down is much easier than what it is for other states. Therefore, keeping on top of it also is much easier. Queensland authorities have moved quickly to impose lockdowns in previous outbreaks this year, but this time they move with weighed against the knowledge that more than 64% of eligible Queenslanders have received at least one dose of a vaccine. So as they're heading towards 70%, the government's choosing to not impose limitations as they have on the past. Now, I think for all of us, quite frankly, folks, this is a good sign. So it's encouraging us to get, as a wider population, to get fully vaccinated so that some of these restrictions can be met. And this is a case in point where, in actual fact, the Queensland government have chosen not to impose lockdowns because the percentage of the population has now been vaccinated. And I think that's sending us all the message that getting vaccinated is the appropriate way to go, and why shouldn't they? And they go on to say Greater Brisbane has already been in lockdown this year, January, March, June and so forth. Right, and this I found quite interesting. So this is where they talk about unvaccinated people more likely to transmit the virus. So the professor said that COVID-19 positive truck driver detected yesterday posed a higher risk because he was unvaccinated, and that's the issue. People who are unvaccinated, their viral load in their nasal passages and upper airways is much higher than in vaccinated people, so they're much more likely to pass the virus on to others, obviously. He said the man from wherever he was from, he was less likely to spread the virus. Said vaccinated people who have lower viral loads, so they were less likely to pass COVID-19 on to others. I think that's an important factor for us to understand as well, is that if we are vaccinated, we're not going to have the amount of virus present within our system, and we're more likely to shed the virus, I believe, a little bit quicker if we've already been vaccinated. So the accommodation is shared. So they go on to say, more interesting stats, is obviously in things like shared bathrooms, you're not going to be wearing your mask at those times. So there is certainly a possibility that the person will have spread the virus. We have data from last year on the original strain, which showed that the virus can hang around for a few hours on some surfaces. And there was some stats here that I'm just wondering whether I can just pick that one up. I think, yeah, this is it. So here they're talking about, what's the title? All right, so this was an interesting one because this is about how contagious is Delta. How long are you infectious? Is it more deadly? And this is a quick guide to the latest science. Okay, data was recognised in SARS-CoV-2, May 2021, and has proved extremely difficult to control in unvaccinated populations. Delta has managed to outcompete other variants, including Alpha, and we often forget that the other strains have kind of gone, that we now have Delta to deal with, and we don't see any of the Alpha strain whatsoever. Variants are classified as of concern because they're either more contagious than the original, cause more hospitalizations and deaths, or are better at evading vaccines and therapies, or all of the above. So how does Delta fare in these measures? The RO tells us which is the rate of transmission, I guess, or the load of virus. Tells us how many people on average one infecting person will pass the virus on to. So if I'm affected, how many people will I pass it on to? Well, the Delta virus, 5 to 8 people, they estimate you can pass it on to if you've got this because of your viral load and the way it spreads. And this compares to Alpha, which was 1 for every 5 to 3 for the original strain. So Delta is twice as more likely. So it's gone from 1 to 5. And so it's more than, well, clearly, Delta is twice to 5 times as contagious as the virus that circulated in 2020. And they have a bit of a little interesting graph here that indicates how many people that can spread to. So one can understand if you've gone from 1 and a bit people to 5 people, that's a massive increase in the number of people. And that's where they're having trouble with the contact tracing, because it's just exponentially gone way off the planet in terms of the number of people that are infected by one person. And of course, those other 5 people will infect another 5 people, and so on. So it makes it almost impossible to be able to catch up. And that's why Victoria and New South Wales are in the trouble that they're in, because they were not able to limit it at the beginning, one thing. And number 2, because it's the Delta strain that they're dealing with on this particular occasion, which is 5 times more infectious. So virus is transmitted through droplets, and infected persons releases when the breath, cough or sneeze. In some circumstances, transmission has occurred where the people touches a contaminated object, then touch their face and so on. We know all that from previous viruses or the previous strains. The virus then continues to replicate, although often there is no symptoms yet. The person has become infectious. And I guess this is part of the problem, is that many people now are infectious or asymptomatic, and therefore people aren't aware that they're infectious, and they're perhaps not showing any symptoms, in which time they can infect others. And I think it's up to 3 to 4 days a person can be, or a little bit more, that can be infectious but not know that they're infecting other people. Hence, that makes the virus particularly of concern. So that's my virus stuff, but then I also wanted to have a look at a pet subject of mine, which this article just reminded me of the other day, and that is Australia's submarine issues. So I get a bit concerned about this because I have an issue with the military spending as much money or the government spending as much money on the military as they do, when we have homeless people, we have welfare services that are not looking after the most underprivileged people in our community, when we're cutting back on pensions, when we're really not caring for the people that matter the most, when we're diminishing services to children, when we're diminishing services around mental health, mental well-being, that sort of stuff. When we're not being able to capture the people in our community who need our help the most, and we're ignoring them, but we're able to spend billions of dollars on these boats that sink. So when the government decided that they were going to do this massive, when they were going to do this revamping of the submarine contract and pass this over to the Americans, there were a number of issues that came to mind. I mean, I was wondering why it is that they needed to change the contract from France to Americans, and part of their reason, I think, was that they wanted to get in the hip pocket of Biden and his crew, and they wanted a submarine that seemed to be something that was far more futuristic, rather than the diesel subs that the French were offering, and that these particular subs are supposedly faster and quieter. And but then I wonder, like by the time they develop these submarines and they make them operational, there will be other technologies that will probably supersede these subs, whether that be drones or lasers from space or whatever it might be. There will be something else that will probably supersede them. But in the meantime, we're busily spending all this money. And then I'm thinking, why it is that we want to do that? Like, why is this in our supposed best interest? Because I don't think it's in mine. Am I fearful of the Chinese invading us? I don't think so. Am I concerned about the Chinese taking over some space in the Pacific Ocean? Well, actually, that doesn't concern me all that much either. Am I concerned about the power that China has in terms of being a financial force? No, not really, because I think if a country earns that opportunity or takes that as an opportunity and is able to develop some sort of financial power, then I think that's a good thing. We saw that after the Second World War in relation to Japan. We've seen it in relation to South Korea, and we've certainly seen it when it comes to Germany. So in the past, we've always accepted those countries, but because it's a communist country, we can't accept that as an alternative, because and this is where the fear-mongering really gets to me, because we're establishing a belief system that tells us that if they're communist, and they do have some human rights problems, no one's going to dispute that, but there again, I think the Americans do too in relation to the CIA and some of the things that they do, and some of the people that they've got within their own country, some of those so-called patriots, the dickheads, the jerks that they have in the US that seem to run Congress and who are part of, their ex-president's loyal band. So I see some extreme contradictions here that I find rather distressing. But then I wonder, was it impossible? Do we have to apply so much pressure on China that at the end of the day, the Chinese that we push the Chinese further away from us? So we're in a position where negotiating with the Chinese becomes almost impossible because we're pushing so hard back against them. We're siding with the US because falsely we believe that they would help us if we're in trouble. I have my doubts, and that we somehow need them to defend us. In actual fact, the only thing that Australia has to offer any other country are our minerals, and coal is the exception because coal will be faded out, but there are lots of other minerals that we produce in this country that are important in terms of providing substances for batteries and for computer parts and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot we produce in that area, but do we need to protect ourselves from increasing China? China at the moment has moved further into the South China Sea because they believe they have sovereignty in those areas, and they're building bases in which they can launch their aeroplanes and whatever it is that they do. No matter what we do, China's going to become more and more powerful. And maybe at some point we need to accept that fact, forget that they're a communist country, and start working with them to develop things that are of mutual benefit to all of us. And I guess one of the things that concerned me too was, the Europeans have been pretty kind to us, I guess, over the years, and we've certainly gone to their country in order to fight the battles with them that, again, didn't concern us, I guess. but that we snubbed them in the way that we did. So you kind of wonder what Morrison has decided to do in terms of snubbing France for the sake of the US. And I think it's extremely misguided. I don't think Morrison really knows what he's doing. I think he believes that the US are going to save us if we need to be saved. I'm sure we could have negotiated some way that the US could support us or run bases from Darwin or whatever it is that they do. But there was no need for us to abandon the French for the sake of the Americans to build a submarine that might even be out of date. And the fact that it is a nuclear submarine, which means that it produces some form of nuclear emission, which we then have to find ways to dispose of. And I just must say, I congratulate New Zealand on saying that they're not going to allow those subs to port in New Zealand. I think that was a fabulous decision by my friend Jacinta. The French are obviously a bit upset about this. Macron made the comments. The comments were that Europeans must stop being so. That he said Europeans must stop being so naive after Australia's decision to cancel the $90 billion submarine deal with France. Made the comments as he announced a new defence deal with Greece, who will buy French Navy frigates worth about $4.8 billion, not the same as the $90 billion. It was the French president's first public comments about the acrimonious ending of the deal, which saw the Australian government terminate a contract with French defence company Naval Group for 12 conventionally powered submarines on September 6th. Canada came just hours before Australia announced the formation of a new alliance. And this is where I think it demonstrates to everybody that Morrison is a jerk, because it was clear that this conversation that the government's been having about changing to the US, the conversation with the US has been happening for months, if not a year or so. And Morrison chose not to tell an important ally of ours, France. So if you can't trust Morrison in this area, what in the hell can you trust him in? The man's deceitful. There's no disputing that whatsoever, and that he will throw you under the bus if he can see a quick way to either make a dollar or make a friend, because I don't think he's got all that many friends, so he obviously needs as many as he can get. And I guess the US are the ones that are prepared to say, I'm prepared to be your friend right now, providing you get rid of the French. And what this actually means for our own security remains to be seen. No one seems to know. I'm sure there are other deals being made along the way about how the US can supposedly help us to push further back around the China Sea and in our region. And there are a whole lot of other countries like Indonesia and Malaysia apparently who are not too keen on what Australia is doing with the US. We see in where China is very good at providing money to build certain freeways and a whole host of other infrastructure deals in Malaysia and Indonesia, and which certainly is a way by which they can generate an income, because they get income for all that. But and perhaps those countries might be a little bit beholden to China as a result of all of that. But if it was a corporation doing that, they would say it was a good thing to be able to invest in other countries in that way. But because it's the Chinese, no, it's not good at all. So be interested if anybody's watched this to offer your comments. It'd be great to hear from you. And I just need to say that if you wish to subscribe to my site, please do so. I don't have many people that are on board, but more than happy to have you present and to hear more about some of the things that we have to say in the future. So take care of yourself, everybody. Look after yourself and be safe.